mic you going, Jimmy? Still, that's it.
Right, good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Birmingham City University, and a warm welcome also to our viewers on YouTube who are watching us live here this evening through the streaming TV channel. Welcome to our Curzon building, which opened last summer here in our city centre campus, and it consolidates our position as a university on two sites now here in Birmingham, both here in the city centre and east side, mentioned by the Chancellor today indeed as part of Birmingham's Knowledge Quarter, which is now being taken forward thanks to some support from the Chancellor at today's budget statement, which is excellent, and also at our Edgbaston campus at the City South location. Tonight you've joined us really for the next series of our future talks, and here we're talking tonight and exploring the future of murder. And I must confess to a slight personal interest in murder, from a somewhat professional point of view, I might add. Firstly, in the 1980s, I spent some time as a detective in Liverpool, a very young detective, I might add, working on a few murder inquiries, and it was fascinating as I think back to that, that largely murder was a fairly straightforward thing, where you just had to really follow up on the various sort of physical contacts that people had had with a whole range of associates, and largely you were able to solve them on the back of that. How times have changed, particularly through technology. The second reason, and Professor David Wilson, who's behind me here, reminded me just a few weeks ago, on Wednesday the 13th of March 1996, I was working in Edinburgh, and suddenly it came through the news channels that there'd been a shooting of some kind in Dunblane. And a number of my colleagues who were living in Dunblane suddenly raced out of the building and took to their cars to head back. Many of them had children at school in Dunblane. And a number of students did the same thing as well. And of course, that was the day when Thomas Hamilton massacred 16 young primary school children and their teacher at Dunblane Primary School. Certainly a date I'll never forget. But really, murder and murderers, the premeditated unlawful killing of one person by another, is something that is changing. And I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed panel here this evening, who are going to be discussing and confronting, I think, some of the issues around the contemporary relevance and changing circumstances around murder as part of our Future Talk series. So Professor David Wilson, Dr. Liz Yardley, Erwin James, and Dr. Jamie Bennett are here to manage and talk through this area this evening. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Jamie Bennett, who will introduce the panel, and I'd just like to thank you for coming along this evening. Jamie, over to you.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming along this evening. It's lovely to be in Birmingham City University. I'm the Governor of Grendon and Spring Hill prisons. Grendon Prison has a long association with Birmingham City University. Grendon is a psychotherapeutic prison, so we deal with men who've committed serious violent offences, most of whom are serving indeterminate life sentences. And but what we do, because we're psychotherapeutic, we enable people to explore their backgrounds, their history, their offences, their attitudes and thinking, and in that way try to help them come to terms with not only what they've done, but some of the experiences they themselves have had, and trying to help them to change their lives. Now, we've worked with Birmingham City University for the last 20 years in many different ways, collaborating on research, but also there is every year a debate between students from Birmingham City University and residents at Grendon Prison. And I think it's the 20th one takes place this Friday, and currently it stands at 18 to Grendon, 2 to Birmingham City. So we are hoping that run will continue. We've got three fantastic panel members tonight to talk through the issue of the future of murder. And I'd like to introduce them, but also we're going to have lots of time for discussion afterwards. And I really hope that you'll take that opportunity, because these events are always best when people get involved. So our three speakers tonight, they'll speak for about 15 minutes each about some research or from their own experience. And then following that, we'll have the discussion. So there are three speakers tonight. First of all, Elizabeth Yardley, who's an Associate Professor of Criminology and the Director of the Centre for Applied Criminology here at BCU. Now, Elizabeth joined Birmingham City University about 6 years ago, and she's really sort of helped to take forward the Centre for Applied Criminology, carrying out a range of research, including about murder and social media, which we'll be talking about today. A particular piece of writing which has had a significant impact and has been really read around the world. But also it's worth mentioning that Elizabeth is, a fantastic academic and teacher, and in 2014 she won the BCU Extra Mile Award for Academic of the Year, so she has a very distinguished position within the university itself. We're also joined by Professor David Wilson. So I've known David for a long time. In fact, when I first met David, I just joined the prison service and he was the head of prison officer training. So he's someone who comes from a background of working in prisons himself and then stropped off and joined academia, a number of years ago. And since then, he's carried out a range of research about media and crime, about murder, and we'll talk about, some really influential research on trying to understand the nature of murder. And I think some of the amazing work that David's done is particularly about understanding murder, not through the perspective of the murderer, but understanding the social position of the victim. And I think that's been particularly important work. But David's also done a lot of work trying to engage the public in thinking about criminological issues. So he does regularly appear in the media and has been involved in a number of programs, most recently Bring Back Borstal on ITV, and also a program called David Wilson's Psychopaths. I thought it was David Wilson as a psychopath, but no, it's David Wilson's Psychopaths. And was also a panel member on Donny Osmond's daytime quiz show Identity, which was a personal favourite of mine. David has also continued to work in the criminal justice system and has previously been the vice chair of the Howard League for Penal Reform, which he did for 15 years, and was also the chair of the Friends of Grendon, where he does great work supporting the prison I govern, and is vice president of New Bridge. We're also joined by a third panel member, Erwin James, who, in my view, is the best prison writer that there is around at the moment, and arguably the best prison writer that there's ever been. So Erwin started to write whilst serving a prison sentence for murder and really discovered an amazing talent. So he engaged with education whilst in prison, achieving a degree, but then also whilst in prison started to write for national newspapers. So he wrote for The Independent in 1994, and he won an award for his writing called the Koestler Award, which is a competition for arts in prisons, and then went on to be a regular columnist for The Guardian. And his columns, which he wrote whilst in prison, were collected and published, one called A Life Inside a Prisoner's Notebook, and the second called The Home Stretch, From Prison to Parole. And I personally have compared his writings to that of Primo Levi, who wrote about his experiences in a concentration camp with incredible depth, insight, incredibly profound writing, and in my view, his work is at the same level. More recently, Erwin has taken up the editorship of the Inside Time, which is the premier newspaper for prisoners, and is available in every prison, and has a very strong position, very influential in the life of prisoners, and has also published his memoir, Redeemable, which came out this year. It's again, very profound work, very honest account of his own life. And those of you who might have brought a copy, he will be around afterwards if you want to sign it. And equally, those of you who have brought a copy of, my book, The Working Lives of Prison Managers, Global Change, Local Cultures, and Individual Agency in the Late Modern Prison, then, I'm available to sign that at the end. So tonight we're going to be talking about the future of murder. And, what I did when I was kind of preparing for this, I went and just had a look at some of the recently published figures about murder in England and Wales, because I didn't really know. I thought, well, how many murders are actually carried out every year? Is that going up or down? How's that changing? And the latest figures go up to the end of September 2015. And what that says is that there were 571 murders carried out in the 12 months before, 574 homicides carried out during that time, which is 71 more than the previous year. So there was a 14% increase in homicides. However, that does take place in a context of declining homicide rates over a significant period of time. And so what we know is that at the turn of the century, it had gone up to around 800 homicides a year. And the figures, which are often published per million of the population, were running at around 17 homicides per million of the population at the turn of the century, but have almost halved down to around 10 homicides per million during that time. So the last year we've seen a rise, but in a longer term trend, a downward trend in murder. So there are perhaps some questions about what is that saying? Is that the start of a kind of change, or is that a kind of blip? I also kind of looked at some of the other questions that we might have. So who are the victims of homicides? And overwhelmingly 2/3 are male. So most of the victims of murder are men. But with women, they're far more likely to be killed by partners or ex-partners compared to men. So there is kind of differences about the nature of homicide when you look at different groups. And again, if you look at people who are under 16, perhaps the image we have is of stranger killings with children. But actually, about half of those people who are under 16 and were murdered during the last year were murdered by a parent or step-parent, and only 9% were murdered by strangers. So there's perhaps a disconnect between what we see in the media and what is the reality. And also when we compare different countries, we sort of see an emerging picture. So in the UK, about 10 per million is the homicide rate. And yet, in Eastern European countries, that can go up to, the highest, Kosovo, 90 per million, so 9 times higher. Scotland has a murder rate of almost double what it is in England and Wales. And yet, some very similar, economically and socially similar countries have a much lower homicide rate. So Italy, France, Spain, Germany, all have lower homicide rates than England and Wales. So what's that about? So we might have questions about what those figures tell us about murder rates, who's committing murders, who's the victims of murder. But also we might have questions about the nature of homicide, how that's changing. So how does global movement change it? How do communications and technology alter the nature of murder? What about culture? How are we influenced, and how are people who commit crime influenced by representations on television or news or through the internet about murder? But also, are there some more enduring features which aren't changing? What about the issues of gender? What about the issues of race and ethnicity? What about the issues of poverty and vulnerability? Are they changing, or are they enduring hard to shift constants in how crime is committed around the world, and in England and Wales in particular? So there's perhaps some questions that we might engage with during the evening, both in the discussions and afterwards. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over the first of our speakers as Elizabeth Yardley. So I'll allow her to introduce her topic. So if you please welcome Elizabeth Yardley.
It's great to see so many people here today. I'm going to talk to you about 2 pieces of research that we've done over the past few years. The first one some of you may have heard of. We published a co-authored paper called Making Sense of Facebook Murder, looking at the role of that particular social networking site and homicide. So what role was Facebook playing, if any at all? The second piece of research is a slightly more recent one, and that looked at a particular representation of homicide in the media, so a particular case that was covered by a US radio documentary, and it looked at the reaction on social media to that particular case. So I'll start off just explaining a little bit about Facebook murder to begin with, and this was where the inspiration for this came from. We'd been increasingly coming across headlines like the one in the Metro up there, so killed over her Facebook status. That young lady is Hayley Jones, who was murdered by her former partner Brian Lewis after she updated her status on her Facebook page to single. And I've come across quite a few cases like this. There are lots of headlines about Facebook murderer, Facebook killer, and I thought, has this actually got any basis in reality? And the picture underneath the Metro, that's a guy called Derek Medina, who murdered his wife Jennifer Alfonso in Florida a couple of years ago. Now, there was something particularly unique about this murder, because he didn't just murder his wife, but he posted a picture of her body on Facebook, and that was why we found out about this. Had he not done that, this would have been one of hundreds and thousands of domestic homicides around the world, which we never get to hear about. So that was why I first got interested in this. So we had a look at reported cases of homicide in which Facebook had been reported to have played a role. And I just want to distinguish between some of the terminology that I'm using here. So I'm using the term homicide because homicide generally refers to the unlawful taking of a life, to which a range of different legal penalties can apply depending on what jurisdiction you're in. So here in England and Wales we have murder, we have manslaughter, we have corporate manslaughter, we have infanticide, and those are a different legal category, so they are the legal penalties. The difference between murder and manslaughter, largely around intention, what did the person intend to do? So, looking at cases of homicide in which Facebook were involved. So this encompassed murder, manslaughter, first degree murder, second degree murder, all of those categories, unlawful taking of a life. So we looked at the news media and we looked at what cases have actually been reported by the news media. So we used a tool called Nexus, which is a global news database. And between the periods of 2008 and 2013, we came across 48 cases globally. That's not very many, is it, when you think that in England and Wales, the most recent statistics for the year ending September 2015 were 574. So not a lot of cases. The highest proportion of cases were in the UK and the USA. Why was that? Was it that they were more likely to be reported in those countries? Could it be that these countries are taking up, the use of social media, ahead of other countries? What might some of those reasons be? Now, in terms of those general trends that Jamie described just now, the general downward trend in terms of homicide, the cases that we looked at that involved social media, involved Facebook, tended to follow that trend. So the media started reporting cases in 2008. We saw a peak in the number of cases reported in 2010, and then it declined. So is it following that downward trend? Well, maybe. But on the other hand, it could be that as social media becomes more normal, it becomes more embedded in our everyday lives, that we're not noticing it as much. So the media aren't reporting on it as much. So in the same way that the media don't report on people's use of the telephone or emails or letters, perhaps they're not reporting so much on the use of social media when it comes to homicide. Male perpetrated crime. Generally, yes. So if you look at the statistics for England and Wales, around 9 homicide suspects are men. And we came across very similar proportions in relation to the cases that we found. In most cases, the victim and the perpetrator have a close social relationship, and we found that was echoed in our research as well. Now, some people were quite surprised at that, and I think part of the reason for that was because of some of the stories that were reaching the headlines were about these dangerous online predators who were going onto social media, pretending to be somebody that they weren't, to lure in victims. So this idea of the stranger homicide, the internet predator, not really true. Because if you think of the way that most of us use social media, it's often to maintain existing relationships that we have. So we're friends on Facebook with people that we're friends with offline in the first place. So it's our friends at university, it's our family, it's people who are already within our social circle. So it wasn't particularly surprising that cases of homicide in which Facebook was involved, there was a close social relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. That's not to say there weren't any online predators, there were a few, but on the whole, people knew one another. Men overrepresented as victims, that's generally the case when you look at homicide. Actually, in our sample, and I'll admit it's a very small sample, women were overrepresented as victims. Now, this was something that was quite interesting for us. Why might this be? So we looked in detail at some of these cases where there were lots of women being killed, and it was cases of domestic homicide where they were being killed by partners and ex-partners, often because something that they posted on a social networking site that their partner or their ex-partner had become offended at. They'd reacted to that and they'd physically attacked that person face to face. And I actually currently have a PhD student looking at this in more detail. So we're going to have a very detailed piece of research coming out within the next few years looking specifically at people's use of social media in relation to domestic homicides and some of the lessons that we can learn around that and what are some of the things we need to be aware of and do. Now, in general, when you look at the homicide statistics, when you look at homicide-suicide, so people who kill somebody else and then take their own life pretty much immediately afterwards, they're very, very small in numbers and in percentage. So generally about 4 to 5% are homicide-suicides, not in our sample. 19% of our cases were homicide-suicides. So this idea of homicide as a performance crime, as the ultimate suicide note. Is there something in that we need to be looking at in more detail? And I think we do as well. So this piece of research, it posed more questions than it provided answers. But I think we are on our way to making sense of people's use of social media in terms of this violent crime. So one of the other things that we were particularly interested in was how had the perpetrators used Facebook in terms of these homicides, and we found 6 types of usage, essentially. Firstly, the reactor, and this was the largest group of people. So these are people who react to content that is posted on an SNS, a social networking site, and by physically attacking the victim offline. So they see something that they take offence at, that annoys them, that angers them, and then that translates into face-to-face violence. Informers, these people use social networking sites to tell their networked public, the people following them on social media, what they're about to do, what they've just done, or both. Vesterly Flanagan, anybody know that name? Yeah, he was the guy who back in August last summer in Virginia in the US, he murdered 2 television journalists, a cameraman and the journalist. Basically, when they were on camera, when they were filming an interview with somebody, the lady who was being interviewed was also injured, but she survived. So these are people who are announcing what they're going to do, what they've done, or doing both using social media. Merrick McCoy is another example of an informer. He posted on Facebook that he was going to kill his daughter and then kill himself, and he went and did that, and there was a very long kind of ongoing custody battle over his daughter in the run-up to that particular crime. Antagonists, these are people who engage in hostile exchanges with one another on social media, which at some point then escalates into offline violence. This is often in terms of young men who are basically, bigging each other up and, being mean and exchanging insults on social media, where they know that there's an audience looking at what's going back and forth. So their idea of status and maintaining face, all of those types of things were going on in those cases. This young guy here, Salim Combo, he was 18 when he was killed a few years ago, by a 15-year-old perpetrator who we can't name for legal reasons, and that was an antagonistic exchange that had gone on before that. Fantasists are people who use social media to perform or engage in a fantasy. So basically, they're living out a fantasy life on social media, which isn't quite real. The boundaries between the real and the unreal have become increasingly blurred. A guy called Mark Twitchell was a Canadian filmmaker who became obsessed with the TV character Dexter and set up a Facebook profile in the name of Dexter and was interacting with people, claiming to be Dexter. And these people clearly knew that he wasn't, but they were still, engaging with him in that way. And he went on to murder somebody that he'd met via the internet in circumstances that were very similar to the Dexter TV series. Predators. So these were very rare. These were people who created profiles on social media, claiming to be somebody that they weren't in order to lure victims to then kill them. Christopher Danavig is an example of one of these cases. He used information that he found on Noma Belmsov's Facebook profile, which was open, which was public, to basically strike up a relationship with her and claim that he was somebody that he wasn't. Imposters. These were few and far between as well. Thankfully, these are people who post in the name of somebody else on a social networking site. Often it was the victim who they had killed. They were posting using the victim's profile to maintain the illusion that they were still alive. So there was a guy who killed his former partner who basically said on her Facebook profile that she'd gone off to live abroad. She hadn't, because he'd murdered her. But he was using social media in that way to divert attention away from himself. So that was Facebook murder. That was our piece of research on Facebook murder. And essentially the key thing that we found from that was that as Facebook is becoming part and parcel of everyday life, we need to look at how it's becoming part and parcel of homicide as well. So there are various pieces of research going on at the moment to answer or to try and answer some of the questions that popped up. The second piece of research I wanted to talk to you about concerns this. Who's heard Serial? Yeah, a very, very popular American podcast made by the same people who make This American Life. And this was, its first season started around about 18 months ago, and it looked at the murder of Hae-Min Lee, young 18-year-old girl there from Baltimore in the US. And her former boyfriend, Adnan Syed, was convicted of her murder. He was convicted in the year 2000. Now, he always maintained his innocence. He said, it wasn't me, I didn't do it, I wasn't there, I don't know. I don't know what happened. And essentially, a family friend of his contacted Sarah Koenig, a very well-known US journalist who used to work for the Baltimore Sun, the newspaper, but also works for This American Life. And she set out to investigate the case, and Serial podcast was born. Now, Serial became incredibly successful. It was the first podcast to reach 5 million downloads. And a fan following very rapidly emerged after that. So one of the things that I was quite interested in was what's going on in terms of people who are interested in this case, because they were discussing it not just around the water cooler, but on social media as well. And I was particularly interested in what was happening on Reddit, which is an online discussion site. And people they talk about everything on Reddit, and there's a huge variety of different topics. So these are called subreddits, the way that Reddit is organised. Now, the Serial subreddit popped up very, very quickly. People wanted a location to talk about this case. And we were very interested to see who was actually discussing this case online. And it didn't take very long for some familiar faces to pop up. So Young Lee, who was the younger brother of Hae-Min Lee, the murder victim, and Tanveer Syed, who was the older brother of Adnan Syed. So the very fact that fans of true crime were talking about this in the same environment as people who were personally affected by this homicide was something that I found quite interesting. And we carried out an analysis of what was going on, a content analysis. What are they talking about? What are they saying? Those types of things. And we really felt that this was very much part of what Mark Seltzer calls a wound culture. The discussion of this type of thing on social media The fact that people were actively engaging with those who were personally affected by the homicides that were being talked about. So, I just wanted to read just a quick extract from what the younger brother of Haymon Lee said on Reddit as one particular line that I found really compelling. He said, "When I found out there was a subreddit for this, I had to do an AMA, that's an Ask Me Anything, for the Reddit community. But sorry, I won't be answering any questions because, and this is all in capitals, to me it's real life. To you listeners, it's just another murder mystery, crime drama, another episode of CSI. You weren't there to see your mum crying every night, having a heart attack when she got the news that the body was found, and going to court almost every day for a year, seeing your mum weeping, crying and fainting. You don't know what we went through." So that was something that I hadn't thought about before. The fact that people discussing these true crime cases online and the people looking at those discussions, well, among them might be people personally affected by these crimes. And that's another area of our research that's rapidly developing at the moment. So 2 points really for me. As social media become part and parcel of everyday life, we need to look at how it's becoming part of homicide. And also this true crime fan culture that we've got that is quite grisly and is quite voyeuristic. Homicide as entertainment, how is that changing in an age of new technology, of social media? How are people who are personally affected by these crimes affected by the fact that this is going on? So those are the 2 points that I wanted to end on. Thank you.
I mean, watching, I always feel like a sort of Crime Watch presenter when you have to sort of caution people that, these crimes are very rare. I mean, when you watch it, it's so commonplace, social media these days, but to sort of hear how those kind of things can happen is quite alarming. I think what was really interesting about that was, this entangled nature of, the real world and, popular culture and how they're mutually influencing, but also about the potentially desensitizing nature of popular culture. So I think there's some really interesting questions there. Okay, we're going to go straight on. David Wilson is now going to present, so I'll leave it to David. Okay.
The receptionist tapped her computer screen, welcomed me to Dunblane and smiled warmly as she handed me my door key. "One last thing," I said. "Can you direct me to the memorial garden? I'd like to pay my respects." The warmth disappeared almost instantly, and her supervisor, who had been watching close by, glanced accusingly at the same computer screen to see if he could recognize my name. It lasted for only a moment, and after professional decorum had been restored, I was duly offered the directions to where I wanted to go. However, that brief exchange seemed to perfectly capture a sense that asking anything about the Dunblane massacre was not something to be done, especially in Dunblane. It's still a scar on their community, which they continue to hide through silence. Perhaps the hotel in Dunblane will need to get used to such questions, for, as Professor Horton was mentioning, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the appalling shootings at Dunblane Primary School in Stirlingshire on the 13th of March 1996, when Thomas Hamilton, using 4 licensed handguns, shot dead 16, mostly 5-year-old children and their teacher, and also shot and injured 17 others before taking his own life. How are we to explain that dreadful mass murder, still the worst in our history? And does the 20th anniversary offer us an opportunity to reflect on it in new ways, now that we've become much more used to such seemingly senseless slaughter? Why had Hamilton chosen Dunblane, a perfectly ordinary setting for this most awful of crimes, rather than somewhere else where he had connections? And why the 13th of March? I travelled to Dunblane to conduct a criminological autopsy, not just on Hamilton, but also on the shootings, to see if in them we might discover the ghastly origins of Utoya Island, Columbine and Sandy Hook, and the other almost monthly tragedies in the United States, whose names quickly become synonymous with death, and then which fade almost as quickly from memory. I drove the 8 miles from Hamilton's home in Kent Road in Stirling to imagine what he might have been thinking about on his 20-minute journey to Dunblane, walked Dunblane streets and drank in its pubs, spoke with the very few people who were prepared to talk to me, visited the memorial garden to their teacher, and reread and read and read again the Cullen Inquiry, the public inquiry that was almost immediately set up by Michael Forsyth MP, at the time the Secretary of State for Scotland, to investigate the shootings. The inquiry had been quick to paint a picture of Hamilton as abnormal, as entering the community of Dunblane like a perverted Pied Piper, as if out of nowhere, to suddenly steal the children from the community through their murders. He was a lone gunman, insane, an oddball with few friends, and thus largely unknown. Above all, he was not like us. The picture that emerges from my criminological autopsy is very different, not just about Hamilton as an individual, but also about his close association with Dunblane, where he had been embedded for almost 2 decades before the shootings. There will be already some who will find everything that I've just said objectionable, but let's consider some of the facts about Hamilton and his relationship to Dunblane. After having been asked to leave the Scouts in 1974, an organisation which remained a target for his anger throughout his life, Hamilton had been running a boys' club at Dunblane High School almost continuously since 1981, with a short break between 1983 and 1985. Permission to run the club on school property had been withdrawn in the summer of 1983 as rumours that Hamilton had been asked to leave the Scouts because he was sexually interested in boys had reached the ears of a number of parents and various officials charged with granting lets to run activities on school properties. However, Hamilton appealed that decision, and a petition in support of him and his boys' club in Dunblane, signed by some 70 people, ended with the endorsement that we are all proud to have Mr. Hamilton in charge of our boys. He has a most activated, excellent quality of leadership and integrity, and is absolutely devoted to his lads. Above all, he cares. This type of local support allowed Hamilton to continue to run a club in the city up until his suicide, which at one time was attended by future Wimbledon champions Jamie and Andy Murray. As well as the club in Dunblane, Hamilton ran at least 10 other boys' clubs at various points in time throughout central Scotland, all of which took place within local schools. Boys would pay a small amount of money to attend, but these clubs might be better seen as lost leaders, which existed to drum up attendance at Hamilton's summer camps, where presumably he could make more money and where he would have greater opportunities to be alone with the boys. At the clubs, boys played football, and sometimes they were even allowed to shoot guns, although the main activity seems to have been gymnastics, where the boys would be asked to strip to their waist and wear ill-fitting swimming trunks, which were supplied by Hamilton. He then took photographs and sometimes videos of the boys exercising in these trunks, so as he claimed, to ensure they were using the right muscles. After the shootings, police would find 445 slides, 542 photographs, and 4,260 negatives, the majority of which were of boys with their tops bare, and 37 videotapes, and a collection of swimming trunks at Hamilton's home in Stirling. Hamilton was a paedophile, and he wanted to be in charge of young boys so that he could groom and abuse them. However, at a time when paedophilia was largely hidden, and when, for example, Jimmy Savile was still regarded as a much-loved celebrity who could fix it for children, paedophilia was viewed as something which didn't really happen in places like Dunblane, the BBC, or indeed more generally. in the same way that Savile was adept at hiding in plain sight and avoiding the label paedophile being applied to him and his various activities being characterized as sexual abuse, Hamilton also successfully prevented these same labels being applied to him, to his boys' clubs, and to his summer camps. Hamilton did that by complaining to and about the police, the scouts, various schools, regional authorities, and through his incessant letter writing to parents. In a pre-email age, for example, it was common for Hamilton to advertise his boys' clubs and summer camps by either hand-delivering letters within the community or having the schools put these letters in their communications with parents. For some, he may indeed have been seen as odd, but not sufficiently so for his activities to be censured, his behaviour criminalised, or the community more generally to shun him and his activities. The word which I use here is silenced. This isn't just the silence that comes from refusing to name what Hamilton's true intentions were, but an official silence by the various organisations which failed to make public their private disquiet about his unsuitability to be in charge of children and to legally own guns. That official silence can be seen from within the Scouts, the various gun clubs to which Hamilton belonged, a number of schools, and the regional authorities which were formally responsible for the running of these schools, and within the police who granted him a firearms license. There now seems to also be a collective silence which serves to dismiss the shootings from the memory, even though, as one woman described it to me, we should talk about the massacre. It's part of our history. Few do. And so, with no sense of history, one local man drinking in a bar in the centre of Dunblane was proud to explain to me, Dunblane is a safe place to bring up kids. Parents sending their children to school on the morning of the 13th of March 1996 must have thought that too. But by March 1996, Hamilton's boys' clubs were in serious decline. In Dunblane, only 5 boys were left, and the complaint about his club in Bishop Briggs had been made at the beginning of the month. The Bannockburn Boys Club had collapsed in January of that year, which had forced Hamilton to write to the head teacher of the local primary school to complain about rumours that were circulating about him. And in this letter, he singled out Dunblane Primary School, where even the cleaners were spreading this poison. Dunblane knew him best and therefore suspected the most. Clearly, the summer camps that year were looking perilous, and Hamilton, who had just reached the limit of his Barclay card, was £6,000 in debt. He'd also been refused a bank loan. On the 6th of March, he again telephoned the Scouts headquarters to complain, and the following day, ever the narcissist, he wrote to the Queen in the hope that she could personally intervene so that he could regain my self-esteem in society. Narcissists, in my experience, are rarely passive. And so he drove the 8 miles from his home in Stirling 1 week later. Hamilton must have decided that the shootings would allow him to regain his self-esteem in a butch and brutal way over those whom he saw as damaging his reputation, which in turn had frustrated his efforts to groom the boys he desired. The shootings were his perverted way of regaining respect. And in suggesting something of those murders in this way, are there elements which we might regard as prophetic? My analysis of the Cullen Inquiry found that mobile phones are mentioned 3 times and the internet just once. So I discovered there was only one telephone line into the school in 1996, that mobile phone signals quickly became jammed, and that, quote, a line in the library was used for the internet facility. Letters being written by Hamilton are mentioned 16 times, although in an age before social media, there was no mention of Twitter or Facebook. That might immediately suggest that we've nothing to learn from Dunblane, especially when a comparable word search of the far-right Christian Norwegian spree killer Anders Behring Breivik's manifesto reveals that the internet is mentioned 64 times, with various pieces of advice about how to use social media to its maximum advantage being offered throughout the 1,518 pages of 2083, a European Declaration of Independence. Yet there's much in Dunblane which is predictive of the mass murders which were to come, and I would suggest to you the ones that we still have to experience, to the extent that I believe that Hamilton should be seen as the twisted father who begets Breivik and his ilk. Consider, for example, Elliot Rodger, who'd spent most of his life trying to be cool, and who began to have, quote, fantasies of becoming powerful and stopping everyone from having sex, and who suggested in the following question, which he posted onto the internet to justify his spree killings in California in 2014, who's the alpha male now, bitches? One can almost imagine Hamilton echoing the very same sentiment. Hamilton was desperate to order the world in a way which gave him power, perhaps even omnipotence. He saw this power as rightly his, but he believed he'd been frustrated in his attempts to gain authority by those who had unfairly accused, shunned, or dismissed him. Often he interpreted this as a result of a conspiracy to prevent him from having what was rightly his, to prevent him from living a life less ordinary, to be a somebody in a world where he was, or where he believed himself to be, viewed as a nobody. Hamilton was a beta male who was desperate to be an alpha. In Hamilton, we see the perverted narcissism of all mass murderers, and also their desperate attempts to seduce you to their own way of thinking. Breivik, Rodger, and the more recent spree killers might use the social media that Liz has been talking about, but Hamilton's letters, hand-delivered and often at night, were the forerunners of the web pages, Instagrams, and manifestos that are now routinely left behind by mass murderers, and which will be pored over after the event for an explanation. Hamilton was a troll and a type of disgruntled employee too. He was angered by his lack of advancement in the Scouts, and then more generally by the failures of his boys' clubs and summer camps. He was also frustrated sexually. Hamilton wanted advancement and success like all the more recent mass murderers, although what he experienced were setbacks and disappointments through his own inadequacies. But with a gun in his hands, he could play God so as to settle once and for all who was right and who was wrong. With a gun, he could take a revenge on a community he had grown to hate. As he would have seen it, his was a righteous slaughter which served to perfectly reorder the world. Is there not something of that in every incidence of mass murder, albeit acknowledging that each will have some extra ingredient added, or indeed missing? What's new is the speed and intensification that has come from the internet being freed from a solitary line into the school's library, which characterized Hamilton's time, so that these personal disappointments much more quickly become the national tragedies we see on our TV screens. The good news is that in Dunblane, one of the solutions to reducing the future incidence of mass murder also emerges. What would have stopped Hamilton was to have made public what many suspected privately. In short, for all the silences to have been voiced. What Hamilton did was extraordinary, but he certainly wasn't, and nor is the place where his killings occurred. Dunblane remains, like most Scottish towns and cities, proud, stoic, and determined to get on with its business without making too much of a fuss. However, for me, it also remains too silent. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think that raised a number of important issues, really. So, there's some ways in which our kind of fascination with murderers and the notoriety that comes with it almost glamorizes them. I don't think, that deconstruction there, I don't think anyone would see Thomas Hamilton as a glamorous figure or a figure of fascination. I think that made it very clear, it's the exact opposite. I think what I also sort of took from that was, the idea of, the effect upon the people who are the victims of this, which is often kind of silent and unheard, and kind of bringing that into the open is something which I know David's done in much of his work, and I think is often too little talked about in when we kind of talk about murder. Okay, we come to our final speaker now, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So I hope you're preparing all your questions, but before you do, you have the opportunity to hear from Erwin James.
Thank you. Gosh, that took some listening to, I've got to tell you. It's a difficult place to be in my shoes tonight, as someone who has perpetrated terrible grief on other people, much to my shame and eternal regret. We talk about Dunblane there. I was there a couple of years ago, David. 2 brilliant presentations, by the way. Thank you very much. I was in Dunblane a couple of years ago, and I went to see the memorial in the chapel there. And the atmosphere in the town, if anybody's been there, is a very subdued place. And I was passing by. I was going to Stirling, and I was passing by, and I saw Dunblane. I thought, I need to go and have a look where these terrible things happened, and I don't know, I just had this sense of going to share some sense of feeling, with those terrible things that happened. And I went to the chapel, and I saw a very simple, subtle memorial to those dreadful deaths of those children. And I stood by that memorial for a little while. I had a little cry. I'm not going to lie to you. It was very difficult to imagine that such a terrible thing had happened, how anyone could behave like that to those most defenseless children. It was an incredibly profound experience for me. As someone who has perpetrated terrible grief and pain on others, when I see terrible crimes committed in the newspapers, I also feel for the people involved, for the victims. I also oddly feel for the perpetrators, because I sort of know, I have such an insight into the lives of people who do terrible things to other people because of my own experience in prison. 2 decades, mostly in high security prisons. I never expected, when I went to prison for life, to be someone who would sit on such an eminent panel and be someone who good people like you would ever want to listen to. I went to prison, I walked through the prison gates, inarticulate, ill-educated brute. I'd lived rough for most of my life, on and off, from my childhood. I'd been someone who didn't really have a function in society. I didn't have a place in society. I seemed to live on the edges. I used to look at communities where good people like you all live and think, how do you get to live in a place like that? How do you become connected, where you sort of have a sense of belonging, and you feel that you have a function, a purpose in a community, and overall in society. Society was never a term that I would have ever have used in my life before prison. I never thought of the outside world as being a society. I was definitely somebody way out on the fringes of society. I wasn't in the beginning. In the beginning I was somebody, a little boy, lived in a house, had parents, had a family. Sort of catastrophe happened and sent us all in different directions. And by the time I was in my mid-20s, I was well versed in the machinations of the criminal justice system. I'd been arrested. I'd had 53, by the time I was at the Old Bailey accused of murder, I'd had 53 criminal convictions. I'd been in drunk tanks, I'd been in young offender prisons. My whole existence has been dysfunctional, chaotic, problem-causing, pain-causing, caused a lot of pain to myself, caused more pain to other people, which is more important to me. Why was that? When I went into prison, when the judge sentenced me to life imprisonment, I didn't really have an understanding of how I'd become what I'd become. I was just a failed human being. I was on trial with my co-accused. We were both pretty much failed individuals. We weren't friends. We were it's even hard to describe us, who we were. We were just floating characters with no purpose and no meaning in life, who ended up together bolstering our sort of criminal identity and inflicted terrible pain on other people, resulting in the deaths of 2 people. When the judge sentenced me at the Old Bailey, I was greatly relieved that my life was over. It was just a failed life, and I wouldn't have minded the death penalty had it been on the statute books. It wasn't. I just took what was coming. I went in there without any expectations or any hopes or aspirations for the future. There was no sense that one day I might become a Guardian journalist. I mean, that's the most, even now when I look back, it's the most ludicrous and ridiculous idea that I was ever going to live again, let alone become someone fit to sit at a panel like this and talk to people like you. There was never a sense when I was in that cell in Wandsworth Prison, a Cat A prisoner, just a chair, a table, a bucket for my toilet, 4 sets of bars on the window at the back, locked up for 23 hours a day, my 6 books a week from the prison library. I even now I look back and think, how did I get from there to here? How did that happen? I walked in those prison gates, an ill-educated, inarticulate brute, walked out 20 years later, an educated, articulate, empathetic writer. How could that happen? Because our prison system, I've got to tell you, is not designed to do that. Our prison system doesn't have really a design. It doesn't have any designed purpose other than keeping people, dangerous people like I was, behind bars. Keep people like you safe from people like I was. That's the primary purpose. But what's the other purpose? We've got a prison governor here, a former prison governor, and a superb, one of the most respected and authentic spokesmen and commentators on prisons and crime and punishment that I've ever come across in my prison journey. There is no real design in our prison system apart from keeping people in. We're not really sure once they're in there what to do with them other than make sure they don't get out. And we've got an army of people who work in our prisons who try to bring some meaning into our prison system. Teachers, psychologists, some good prison officers, some amazing prison governors. A whole lot of people in there that should not be allowed to be in charge of other human beings and have keys and have power over them. They're luckily in the minority. So we have the sort of things in place to make our prisons places where good things can happen. But as a society, we don't care. Before I went to jail, I didn't care. I was somebody who, if I thought about prison, I thought, mustn't get caught committing crime or I'll go to prison. I didn't think, mustn't do a bad thing or I'll go to prison. But once I was stopped in my tracks, I'm in Wandsworth jail, I'm serving life imprisonment, 99 years. I never thought there was a future for me. They took me to my first long-term high security prison, and then I saw possibilities. There was an education department, there was a library, there was settlers, and there was a good prison governor who came to see me in my cell. He said, my job is to get you back out there. It's going to be hard, he said, it's going to be tough. He said, and I thought, wow, what an optimistic thing to say to me, this governor. His name was Mr. Coxon. I'll never forget him. He was a terrific guy, a naive optimist, I think. But on my wing, there were 85 men convicted of murder. There were serial killers. There were child abductors. There were terrorists, serial rapists. It was the worst of the worst. We were a grim club to be a part of. And there was barely a spoon of hope between us. When I hear David talking about, and Liz talking about categories of, murderer, and this idea that the internet and social media has created a new breed of murderers that need new labels. I'm skeptical. I've got to tell you, I'm skeptical. I was in those jails for 20 years with every type of offender you can imagine. They were all, they had labels. The Red Talk Press gave them labels. there were two guys in one high security prison I was in who the red tops had labelled the Fox. You know, if you Google the Fox, there's a number of people come up. There's two particular ones, and in the exercise yard, these two distorted thinking characters were arguing about who was the real Fox. I'm the Fox. I'm the fucking Fox. You know, and it was really weird to see these people who'd been totally demonized by the press, and that demonization has sort of gone above. It's sort of gone over their heads. They were now I'm the Fox, you know. Cat A, one of them had a donkey jacket with a blue plastic pad on his back shoulders, and he had a great big A with stars around it because he was a Cat A prisoner. He was the Fox. And there is what happens when you're in prison. It's very hard not to. You're already when you're involved in the most serious crime, already your thinking is distorted. You know, when I look back to how I was thinking, you know, the criminal mindset is an incredibly selfish, terrible place to be. You know, you don't think about the impact of your crimes. You don't think about the impact of your actions on your victims. You know, you become so selfish and survivalist. Once you're in jail, whatever the media says about you, whatever academics say about you, you're in prison and you're faced with the truth of your actions. Now, I promise you, I'm not a spokesman for prisoners. I'm not an apologist for prisoners, I never have been. There's no excuse for crime as far as I'm concerned. Not my crimes, not anybody else's crimes. But my experience was that the majority of the people I lived with all those years in those high security prisons was that they had the desire not to be what they'd become. They had the desire not to be criminals, not to be murderers, rapists and paedophiles. Luckily, there are very few of those in our jails. 70% of the people, men in our prisons, are in there for non-violent offences. So murderers and rapists and paedophiles are in the minority, thankfully, thank God. But the majority of the people I met, I don't owe them nothing. You know, I don't want to see them again. Hopefully, I don't want to see them. They're not my friends. I don't want to see them. But I owe them to tell you this. I owe them, through my experience, to say that the majority had the desire to be better than they were when they went to prison, to have their issues resolved that turned them into these damaging, harm-causing people. I was lucky. I met a psychologist called Joan Branton who persuaded me I had some value. She said, we're all born lovable. We're all born with the potential to be who we should be. That made me cry. She said, you've got to get an education. I said, Joan, I'm too thick for education. No, we're all born lovable. We're all born with potential. Even me, even you. You know, I wasn't the blue-eyed boy. She was like that with everybody in that wing. You know, she was a real champion for people, broken, defeated, harm-causing people like I was. So I'm skeptical about this idea that the internet is creating a new breed of murderers. I'm guessing it's a facility for connecting people in a way that definitely wasn't there 20 years ago. But people will always be, you know, when whoever invented the wheel thousands of years ago, I bet within a short time somebody ran somebody over with that damn wheel. I mean, it's bound to have happened, you know. When we move forward with technology, we are still base, we're still greedy, we're still selfish, we're still covetous, we're still angry and jealous. Look at us, you know, whenever I see capsules sent out to space, you know, with messages for the aliens that, oh, we're the human race and we come in peace, you know. And I think, Christ, if the aliens come here and see what we do to each other, how we hate each other, how we harm each other, you know, we're still basically the same human beings. There's good and bad in all of us. Thank you very much.
Well, I mean, it's always very interesting to hear from Erwin, and I really do recommend his books to you. Very humanising, I think. If anyone thinks that, you know, that could never be me, that could never happen, then I think you should read his books. And, you know, it's very humanising to kind of think that in terrible circumstances, you know, I'm sure we are all equally capable of doing terrible things. But Erwin has shown amazing character in sort of accepting his responsibility and, you know, moving on from that. And I think it's, you know, it's a great testimony to the human spirit. Okay, it's over to you now. So I'm sure you've had lots to think about from those presentations. So I've got a microphone. I learnt this one from David Wilson. So you get a microphone, and what you do is you walk around like you're Kilroy or something, because of course none of you remember Kilroy, but it was a good enough pun to use. But right, so let's have some questions. Okay, you were very bold there. We've been to the gym today. You're very big.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Right. Does this work? Yeah.
Students misbehave.
Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for those talks. I think we all agree they were fascinating. In my own research, I come across the Long Island serial killer who used Craigslist to basically get access to sex workers. Hasn't been caught yet, to my knowledge. So my question is, what are some of the obstacles or challenges that this technology presents to authorities? Is it in some ways does it make it easier if they post it online, or in some cases is it make it more difficult?
I think there are two things really, two main things I'd respond to that with. Firstly, there's an area of jurisdiction. So often when police are gathering evidence in cases, you know, drawing on social media, drawing on websites, it's the country that site is hosted in, which will often, the laws of that country will often affect, you know, how much they can actually obtain, how long it takes them to get hold of it, and that type of thing. Secondly, I think that the fact that we're increasingly living out our lives on social media, and the amount of information we're sharing can, you know, sometimes be a good thing in terms of investigating crime. We see several different documentaries and news articles, you know, covering silly criminals. Look at what these stupid people have posted on their Facebook page that's, you know, led them all the way to jail. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, really.
Okay. Yeah. Do we have more questions? If you don't ask questions, then what I will do is I will come round and I'll pick you out, because that's another technique that I learned from Professor Wilson.
This is for Erwin. What was the turning point when you was in prison that, you know, you thought all of a sudden I need to change? Obviously it was your psychologist as well, but what was going through your head that, you know, I need to be a better person and not go back out and become a serial murderer and keep doing crime?
God forbid. No, it's a good question. You know, what was the turning point? People often ask me, you know, in a way, because I became a writer, so that's why I'm sitting here. If I'd got out of jail and become a plumber, you'd never have heard of me ever again. But because I became a writer, I ended up in the sort of semi-public figure, which I never intended. That was never in my plan. But I'm quite happy to try and explain to you that when you're locked up, even when I was a boy, you know, I was in not child prisons, like teenage prisons. I was in detention centre in Borstal. As soon as I was in a cell, I thought, how has this happened? Is it meant to be? You know, I was already questioning my own sort of destiny, if you like, as a kid. But then once I got into the sort of gladiator school of prison life, I stopped thinking. You know, you haven't got time to think. You just try and manage where you are. When I got my life imprisonment, it's when they locked me in Wandsworth prison, and you know, I've got 99 years. I'm looking ahead at a long black tunnel, and it's a lonely place because you don't share. You know, when you're in a long-term prison, they're not all mates together. Okay, prisoners are not all mates together. They're all strangers, all crammed in, all with varying levels of dysfunction and inadequacy. You don't sort of say, "Oh, how are you doing there? How's your rehabilitation going?" How you don't share that. You walk out tough, pumped up, you do your press-ups, you stroll out looking like a tough guy. But in the cell, I'm thinking to myself in Wandsworth, how has this happened? Was I born bad? Did I choose? You know, I made choices that led me to the prison gates. But why did I make those choices? You know, if I had free will, I would have free-willed myself to be a successful writer 30 years ago. No, mind, you know, taking all this time. I started to think about how I'd become what I'd become. That was the turning point. And I had an ambition to try and find out if there was any more to me than that. And I'm not alone in prison. So many people, that's exactly what happens. That's the desire. A lot of people in jail, sometimes the problems they have are too deep-rooted. They might have the desire, but the problems are too... There's not enough resource in jail to meet the need, you know. But that was being locked up. I mean, long answer, I do apologise, but, you know, how do any of us become who we become? Was I born bad? Was I born a criminal? Then I met the psychologist who said, we're all born lovable. That gave me hope, you know.
Okay, thanks. We've got the confident row here, so they're going to ask another question. People can put up their hands while other people are answering, then I can come round.
Hello, everyone. I was really interested that towards the end, Erwin, you seem to be suggesting that there was, in some way, a disconnect in that you didn't think murder was changing. I wanted to ask a question that is about really how the social conditions might lead to murder changing, and to try and move us towards a point where I think there might be some unity between all three speakers. We're now living in a social world where, yeah, certainly social media proliferates, but the real changes that we face and the real changes in terms of where murder may go, I think, are very well evidenced by people like Danny Dorling, in that exactly the experiences that you talk about, being marginalised, being impoverished, being disadvantaged in hollowed out communities where there is very, very little hope, creates the conditions under which murder is increased. And with that in mind, I'd just like the panel to think a little bit about the time that we're in terms of austerity, in terms of economic turbulence, of insecurity, of welfare cuts, and say something to us about where they think the future of murder may go in Britain, not perhaps immediately, but over the next 20 years.
Okay, that's all we've got time for. Right, okay, well, David, you haven't spoken yet, so that's a great question. So, changing social circumstances, inequality. Go on, David.
Well, the first thing to say is because of what I was presenting, I didn't really want to say, I wanted to start with my presentation as opposed to thanking you for attending. And it's nice to see so many of my students, postgraduate and undergraduate, so many of my colleagues, and a number of my Twitter followers, so thank you all for coming. The simple answer to that question is that I think that in terms of serial murder, I've made the point several times that I think serial murder will become much more apparent within the nighttime economy of towns and cities, where a lot of young people in particular are invited to consume vast amounts of alcohol and become incompetent to look after themselves. And most of the serial murderers I've worked with are very calculating about where they will best be able to find suitable victims. I think murder will be like the poor who are always with us. I think the other places where one sees murder is, and it was Adam Lyons who mentioned Craigslist, sex workers continue to be targeted. And I think the elderly in our community continue to be targeted. Those people who are deemed not to be needed, successful, productive within hollowed out neoliberal economies tend to remain the victims of crime generally and of murder specifically. So I would have thought that's the short answer to that question.
I just wanted to pick up on some of the points that Liz made in her presentation. With the fact that serial was so high profile and now we've got sort of making a murder as well, and people are starting to want these cases to be looked at again, I just wanted to know what you think the implications of that might be on the criminal justice system as well as offenders' behaviour.
I think in terms of the criminal justice system, I think we're going to see increasing pressure on organisations that help people look into their convictions again, people who support prisoners who are wrongfully convicted. So I think we're going to see the voluntary sector part of the criminal justice kind of nexus really come under increasing pressure. But I also think another key thing that seems to have come out of Serial and Making a Murderer and various other cases that are being covered is this idea of kind of crowdsourcing justice. So people listening to these podcasts and watching these documentaries and saying, oh, I lived there back then, I remember this or I remember that, whether or not that's true. I think that idea of everybody participating in this is an interesting one, and we need to look at why people are doing that. Especially when it's not true, some of the things that they're saying. So we're going in an interesting direction with that, I think.
David, why don't you make a programme like that, which is trying to solve a crime during the programme?
I think Jamie, you already the serious reply to that semi-serious question is linked to what you asked. And I did make 2 series of a program called Killers Behind Bars, in which I was very deliberately trying to harness the public's fascination for true crime to demonstrate a hypothesis, which was that most of the serial murderers I've worked with are guilty of a number of murders which are so-called cold cases and unsolved. And I think what links that program or those series, the first case we featured, by the way, was that I claimed that Robert Black, who was a paedophile who targeted children, had murdered a young girl called Jeanette Tate. And when I said that on screen in that series, the Devon and Cornwall police were not very happy. And guess what? Just before Robert Black actually died 2 months ago, they were about to arrest Robert Black for the murder of Jeanette Tate. I think what is interesting about what Liz has said is a lot of the public's fascination for true crime, for serial, for crowdsourcing, is now revealing a great deal about investigations. Have you looked at this? Have you considered these facts? Here's somebody who's popped up to say that they were never interviewed or that had evidence that might have been worthy of consideration. And I think what we are going to see is a number of cold cases become very hot if this, by and large, still American phenomenon, the making of the murder, making a murderer is very much an American. We're completely addicted to Missing Maura Murray, for example. That's the one that Liz and I listen to. But I think when that becomes much more British, I think some of the notorious cold cases that we're aware of will become hot again.
Hi, I work for the probation service, and my question was for Erwin. I wanted to know how long you served on your IPP sentence, and then I also wanted to know how you found the support from the probation service to help you along your desistance journey.
My desistance journey, wow, what a great phrase. My desistance journey. You know, this is the thing, as an offender from the sort of cradle to the grave, you've got to negotiate all this strange criminal justice sort of language, but it was a life imprisonment. It wasn't IPP, it was life imprisonment, mandatory life, times 2, with a minimum recommendation of 14 years at my trial. That was raised after I'd done 10 years. There was a review by the Home Office of life sentence tariffs, and sort of 70 to 80% of life sentence prisoners at the time had their tariffs raised. Mine went to minimum 25 years after I'd done 10 years. How did I manage that? What could I do? I was grateful that I was still alive and could survive the vagaries of the prison experience. I had amazing support from the probation service. I mean, whenever I hear the government and the media slagging off probation officers, it's changed now only because, we've got this so-called rehabilitation revolution where we've privatized 70% of the probation service. But I was sort of under probation as a relatively new life sentence prisoner. And the probation officer used to come and visit me every 3 months. She'd send me books in. She'd come and she'd write to me, how are you doing there? I'd write back and say, I'm doing good. I'm managing this. or passed an exam. You know, the probation officer was somebody who was like somebody who was interested in how I was making progress. You know, it was one of those. There was a number of people in my early prison sentence, when I look back, who were really interested in me making some progress. Now, I didn't know what progress meant. It just meant, to me, it was staying alive and trying to make some sense of my situation. And the years passed, and it was actually a probation officer who got me writing for The Guardian 15 years in, whose neighbour was a writer who was connected to The Guardian. And he came to see me and said, what are you doing here? I said, I do a bit of writing. I'm the guy that can write a good letter. He said, oh, my neighbour's a writer. Ronan Bennett, the Irish writer, novelist. I dropped him a note. He connected me to The Guardian. The Guardian were looking for a convict who can write about prison life. Ronan said, oh, I know one who can write. I got connected there. That was a probation officer. I'm still good friends with that chap, even now. Post-prison, as a prisoner on probation, not now. I am. I'm on license for the rest of my life. Till I die, I'm a prisoner serving my life imprisonment. But I don't have to see a probation officer. You know, that was signed off years ago.
But Erwin, the two questions that have been directed to you have all, in a sense, been about how do you explain suddenly becoming a non-offender? Whereas, in fact, I think it's the wrong way of thinking about the question we should ask you, because actually you had a non-offending lifestyle. There were problems in your lifestyle, and if people read Redeemable, they know what some of those problems are. But you had a non-offending lifestyle, and what really needs to be explained is why you chose to offend.
That's a good question. Why did I choose to offend? I mean, prison officers would say to me, don't complain about the chips, because they were always cold. You chose to come here. I used to scratch my head at that one. I chose to come here. It meant you chose to commit crime. That's why you're in prison, so don't complain about the conditions. When I made those choices, when I was a boy, you know, I was living rough. I broke into a sweet shop, my first crime. Why did I do that? I knew it was wrong. You know, there's nobody, you know, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, you know as a kid right from wrong, and I knew right from wrong. Why did I choose to do that? I just wanted sweets. That's all I can say. But once I was convicted and I was given the label criminal, a convicted burglar, taken into the care system, me and the other kids in the care system, we thought of ourselves as criminals. We bolstered each other's criminal identity. Oh, when we grow up, we're not going to be train drivers and astronauts and professors and prison governors. We're going to be gangsters, criminals and killers, you know. And sadly, a whole load of us, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, we've got a question from a viewer on YouTube for David Wilson. How do you stop yourself from absorbing a tragedy you work on?
Often I can't. I'm completely human. I'm a husband. I'm a father. Even though Jamie Bennett left my statement that I was a human, often I'm in those circumstances and I'm completely caught up. I cry regularly about some of the things that I see and have to experience. And often, though, it's about remembering why I'm there and managing my emotion at that particular moment in time. But do I have empathy with what I see? Am I affected by what I see? Yeah, of course I am. And in fact, I probably would stop doing what I do if I wasn't affected by it, because then it would be a stage too far, I think.
A question towards Elizabeth with her research. It's about that list that you made about murderers, most of which are direct, they have a direct relationship with their victims. How about trolls, which lots of comments lead victims of those comments to go to suicide, towards suicide, or internet challenges like Ice Bucket Challenge or planking, that sometimes because of which people die and tragical relationship. Would you consider that some kind of indirect future murder?
I think what we do need to look at very closely is the fact that we're communicating through technology, through network technology. Is that actually having an impact on what we say and what we do? And back in 2004, an academic identified something called the toxic online disinhibition effect, which basically was that when people are online, they can't see the reactions of the other person. You can't see how they're reacting in terms of their face. There's no eye contact, and that lack of social cues in mediated communication could be one of the things that we need to look at in terms of why people are horrible to other people on Reddit, why people take huge offence at things that are posted on Twitter. So I think that there are questions about that and the impact it has on our behaviour.
Okay, we've got one more question here, and then we'll have one more question after that, and that'll be the last question. So it better be a good one, whoever's going to come up with it. We'll have the second last question here.
Hi, this is for Erwin. Had social media been around 20 years ago, how do you think it would have affected your case? Do you think it could have been a positive thing, maybe connecting you with society, maybe making you not want to commit your crime?
Gosh, that's an amazing question. If I'm honest, it's very hard for me to look back and think, had Facebook, I'm not even on Facebook now, so I'm not sure I would have been on Facebook then. I wasn't someone who partook in this sort of community-wide connection situation. I wasn't somebody who was well connected, so I'm not sure that it would have made any difference at all. All I would say is, in jail, going back to a question earlier on up there about social deprivation, it seemed relevant to me that most of the people I met in prison were people who'd been through the care system, weren't educated, didn't have work skills, didn't have confidence, had often an over-exaggerated impression of having loads of confidence, this bravado and machismo. But actually, I was in prison with people. One of my neighbours was a man serving life for murder who was one of the most eminent surgeons in the country, been to public school, had a great education, had a fantastic home, killed his wife, was a murderer, was a Cat A prisoner, was my neighbour. So I'm not sure about this social media thing, other than it creates a facility for people to become, perhaps, to go to the edge where maybe they wouldn't have gone to the edge when I was there 20 years ago, and I fell over the edge and couldn't hold myself back. I think social media is a facilitator for people to, well, we see, this troll stuff. You see people who would never imagine these people venting such vitriol and bile at fellow human beings, and they do it because this disinhibition that Liz talked about. I think there is a sense of doing that, but I don't think it made much difference in my case, if I'm honest.
Last question.
I do have some concerns about the topic, the future of murder, because on occasion all three of you have dipped into what, and particularly the lady, Liz, into murder as entertainment in the future. In my experience, having been on 2 murder inquiries, in actual fact there's very little information from the public, rather than a lot. And I don't see that changing for the simple reason a lot of people don't realise the information they have is of importance. Second one is they don't have the motivation to pass it on to anybody else. And I do think that at the moment we're rather overplaying the impact of social media. I'm a bit of a pessimist over murder. I'm surprised there's so little of it, rather than more. And my fear is, in actual fact, it's going to be easier to kill more of us easily. Thankfully in this country, not with guns, normally.
I think there's an interesting paradox, isn't there? In terms of the rise of social media, the rise of our lives being visible and public, yet at the same time, really wanting to preserve privacy. So, the idea of privacy around the family, that you don't share lots of information about your family and what you do and where you go, and information that is personal and private to you. So we've still got the notion of, the private sphere at the same time as we've got this explosion in social media and public presence. And I think that is quite an interesting tension that we've got that we need to contend with, definitely.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all of your questions. There were some fantastic questions there. There were a couple of ropey ones, to be honest, but most of them were pretty good. Just kind of a couple of the themes that I think we've kind of talked about. We've kind of tried to engage with the idea of how, murder and crime might be changing with some of the elements of late modernity. This idea of, the information technology, movement around the world, growing levels of inequality. How does this kind of shape and affect the way that crime is practiced almost, but also the ways in which it's represented, and links between the representation of crime and how crime is actually committed, as well as how it's perceived by people. But also, I think many people have touched upon some of the enduring and unchanging elements of crime, in particular the social circumstances, the issues of inequality, the issues of vulnerability, and how do we kind of deal with some of those things. But also, I think what we've heard about is some of the really deeply human aspects of crime, and how the ways in which people behave and the people respond to these circumstances, you know, reveal some of the darkest aspects of the human condition, but also can show some of the lightness that there is in the soul of every person. So thank you very much. Thank you to the panel for wonderful presentations. Thank you all for coming along and joining in, and congratulations to BCU for this fantastic event. Thank you.
Close off, ladies and gentlemen, particularly to thank Jamie, Erwin, Liz and David for the talk tonight. Worth remembering that earlier statistic, I guess, that murder fortunately remains a very rare event in our society here. I was particularly struck by Erwin's observation, actually, that there's good and bad in all of us, which certainly gives pause for thought. As I mentioned earlier, Erwin will be here signing books if you brought one along later this evening, so by all means engage. And I'd like to invite all of you, if you want to stay, we have some refreshments out the door to the left. Please do stay and partake. For those of you following our Future Talk series, the next one is actually on the future of the European Union, which takes place in May and is particularly topical. But thank you for coming along, and thank you again to our panel tonight. Thank you.